Welcome to Season 5 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 8, we'll be talking with Alicia Bruce about collaboration and advocacy. Alicia is a Scottish working-class artist, photographer, community collaborator, educator, and activist. Her photography sits between documentary and staged imagery. She's interested in local and global communities and aspires to tell humane stories of people and place, often looking through the history of art for visual referencing. Within the communities Alicia documents, she's interested in environmental issues, human rights, equality, feminism, politics of space, territories, and heritage. Her photographs are held in several public collections, including the National Galleries of Scotland, University of St Andrews, and the UK Parliament, among others. All of her commissioned work is directly linked to her practice and values, often involving charitable campaigns or political organizations for exhibition and publication. Alicia is also a teaching fellow at Edinburgh College of Art, University of Edinburgh, and she's the founder of Portobello Photography School. Could we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
Yes, so I've got quite a few strands to my work. I'm a working class artist, photographer. I work mostly in my own practice as collaborative social documentary style work. I also teach. I've got a few teaching hats. I'm a teaching fellow at Edinburgh College of Art, and I run my own business called Portobello Photography School in my local area where I teach people photography. And I work on quite a lot of commissioned work as well. So a lot of my commissioned work reflects my values as well. So I work on sort of charity campaigns and editorial projects. Mostly I get quite a lot of work through Women Photograph, which is brilliant. I'm really, really happy about that and the type of offers that I get through that. And charity campaigns, I work with homeless charity Crisis. I worked on the Zero Tolerance campaign to end gender-based violence, that sort of thing. So I take on projects that I feel reflect my values as a person. And editorial, I've recently worked with Harper's Magazine, and again, it's all based on the story that gets pitched if I take it or not, usually. And also, like everyone, just try to balance. Try to keep the roof over our head whilst maintaining my ethics.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that can be a real challenge sometimes, can't it? To have to turn away work, paid work, if it doesn't really jive. I guess, when did you make that decision to focus only on things that really reflect, or is that something you've always done?
I guess when I realised that that was a possibility, that I could do that. And sometimes, you have to just, it's informed, but also you have to follow your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, sometimes it's like, look at how's this going to fit in the wider term. So, yeah. And maybe I haven't always made the right decisions. I'd have to really think back. But I tend to sort of go with, when I first started out in photography, I worked in community education. So with places like the Workers' Educational Association and places like Whale and Wester Hailes, which is a sort of social housing development in Edinburgh, very like the one that I grew up in Aberdeen. So right away I was doing community collaborative work. And then I was also working for the National Galleries of Scotland. I used to do pictures for them of like events and workshops and portraits of visiting speakers and stuff like that. So that was fun.
Very good. And what does collaboration look like for you in your practice?
Collaboration, it's respect. It's having complete respect for the person that you're working with and that you're making a picture with. I think I guess speaking about my work in many, so for 16 years I've been making work about Donald Trump's impact on the northeast coast of Scotland, which is where I grew up. And all of the portraits that I've made there have been very collaborative with the local residents. I knew them for 3 months before I made portraits. And the whole process was I kept going away and shortlisting paintings that I thought reflected them or had some sort of parallel with their personality or their situation and things like that. And we would go through these short lists of paintings and then discuss how they wanted to be represented, where they wanted to stand, and the whole point was that they were being so misrepresented, particularly in the local press and the local news, but also on international news. You know, they had international news crews at their doorstep a lot. And Donald Trump had called Mike Forbes the village idiot. He said he was the village idiot, that his house was a pigsty. I think it was on Letterman. Mike kept getting asked to react to things that Donald Trump was saying about him, this crofter that Trump tried to sort of belittle and didn't respect. And he kept being represented in pictures as this sort of angry man, like Mike was. And I just thought, this just doesn't ring true, like the way he's being represented. So I just wanted to meet him and see what he was like. And honestly, we got on so well. The minute we met, he's like, oh, come in, do you want a drink? You know, he was hosting an art exhibition in his barn. You know, so like the contrast of this really lovely, hospitable, kind, friendly man, and then the angry person in the local newspaper, you know, it couldn't have been more different. He really reminded me of my dad and my uncles, and we just got on really well. And Sheila, his wife, she had never been a sort of public face of anything that was going on. It was implied that Mike lived on his own with his mum. It was all a bit twisted. So I wanted to make sure that we made a picture together where they had complete control over how they were represented, because they kept being misquoted and misrepresented or lured into saying things that didn't reflect what they wanted to say by the media. So it was a really long process, and they ended up choosing American Gothic, the Grant Wood painting, for multiple reasons. But it was that empowerment of having control in a time where they weren't having enough control over how they were represented in the media. With my picture, it was all about how they wanted to be seen, where they stood, what they wore, the positioning of the camera, the positioning of them, everything. So it was a long process. And ironically, they always say now that they really enjoyed that. You know, it's all about something really serious and awful that happened to them. But the process of making pictures, all of the many residents really enjoyed that, because it's sort of, I think it was quite therapeutic, but also it was less stressful than everything else that was going on. And we all get on so well that, so...
I'm sure it was a bit of fun as well, you know, to conceive of this idea and perform this idea in collaboration as well. Like, it's nice to not shy away from the idea of play as well, I guess, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, that's true, actually. I mean, play is really important, isn't it, in creativity? Yeah. So I think in a way it was a really beautiful process for everyone. And with Molly, Mike's mother, she chose To Pastures New by James Guthrie, the Goose Girl, famous painting in Aberdeen Art Gallery. It reflected the fact that she was a land girl, it reflected her childhood, and it reflected her positive spirit, although Trump was trying to, you know, compulsory purchase order her house and belittling her family, but she still had this really beautiful spirit. When we made pictures of Molly, Sheila had the brioche out, and she was trying to attract the geese to walk in a line. And then I was sort of moving. Molly had a walking stick. You know, she was in her 80s, so she wasn't moving too much just because we were in the field. And Mike was looking after the horse. And then we were stopped by the police. The police came down from Trump's sort of land and asked me to put my camera away. They said that there was unusual activity in the area. They want me to stop. And then I asked if I could take a picture of them, and they said no, because it wasn't an official visit. But this kept happening. It's almost seemingly innocent, you know. For all they know, I could have been their daughter or their niece or, you know, whatever. I'm making a picture with a lovely lady on her family land, and it's enough to cause the police to come to this really remote area. That happened a lot.
Wow. I think it's really interesting what you're talking about the media representations as well, because I think there is this sort of myth of objectivity, right, in journalism. But I think it's really interesting, you know, this idea that we do look to journalism to provide access into something, but that the way that people are being represented was so wildly different from actually who they are and what their story is.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this is another thing that I've really considered over time with the way that I work collaboratively in portraiture. Some people have not understood why I do that, but I think that there's so much staging happens in photojournalism which isn't admitted to as well. You know, you see all these videos of, a sort of press pack and someone standing on a vehicle on fire and they're looking for that iconic image. And it's all, well, not all of it, but a lot of it is sort of staged or encouraged in a way that'll get an eye-catching picture. But I don't see what I'm doing as any less honest, because we're revealing the process that it's a sort of two-way thing. It's not like I'm saying you stand there and I'll do this. It's a more honest way, I hope, of working.
Yeah, no, totally. And there are all kinds of staging that happen, not only intentionally, but also just by our presence and how we affect the situation around us, that people might do things or put themselves in more danger or do things that are more risky or perform for cameras. So I think you're totally right that, the transparency is really what's key, I guess, isn't it?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I feel like it's an honest way to work. That's been a joy to do with everyone in Many, to have everyone really, really involved. And it still happens to this date. I mean, some of the more recent pictures that are in my book, it was often the same approach. And it's a special relationship, I think, to be able to do that.
Absolutely. And you said that you've been thinking a lot about the types of stories that you're doing and making sure that things are really aligned with sort of your personal ethics. How do you talk about that? How have you developed a framework for talking about that or for describing that kind of work?
I think through experience. I think it's because we're all learning all the time, aren't we? And we're all reflecting on how we do things all the time. And I remember when there was the first exhibition of the Many work about Trump in Scotland work was early 2011. I mean, I didn't know if this would resonate with people beyond Aberdeen. I really didn't know. And it ended up quickly being in international news, which was amazing for me as a photographer, as an artist, to use my sort of my skills and my conduit sort of way of working to share what was happening with these people. It was the first time they'd ever represented themselves authentically and not been sort of taken from, if that makes sense, because they'd been involved in the pictures. But at the time I was interviewed by STV News, the local sort of TV news at 6, with a lovely journalist called Anne Smith. And I said at the time, and I think it was clumsy language, the intention was good, but I said, and I still regret it now, I said I wanted to give them a platform to speak from. And I wanted to use my photography in a way that would share the residents' voices. Saying a platform to speak from, now I think, no, that's not what I meant. That was not what I meant to say. But, I had a big exhibition opening. I'd travelled all the way from Edinburgh. I probably was high on adrenaline because I thought I was going to get arrested at this opening. We'd been prompted that might be a possibility.
Oh, wow.
From being accused of trespassing on Trump's land and all this kind of stuff. So there was a lot of anxiety there. And I knew I was doing a good thing, but I regret that phrase now. I wouldn't use that phrase now because it's not really what I meant. I don't like hearing photographers saying they're giving voice to people. It really irks me because it's they've got their own voice. People can speak for themselves, but all we can do is we maybe have different channels that we share information.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And you said something earlier about how, you're not one to automatically theorize about, the way that you're working or why you're working the way that you're working. I think that's really interesting because I think that that's something that will resonate with a lot of photographers, that, a lot of photographers are not sort of thinking about, well, why am I doing it this way? I think personally, I feel like there's a lot of value in thinking through that. And I guess I wonder if you could speak to that, sort of to the value maybe of stepping back and thinking about how we practice. Because I think that it's nice to hear from other people why you do that. Why do you spend the time to do that,
I guess it was a confidence thing as well. I didn't feel like I was a very academic student. I didn't have a lot of confidence in myself. So I think it's this sort of thing. I didn't want to theorise or use any sort of pretentious language around my practice because I want it to be accessible. I never make work that's for a gallery audience. I make it for anyone and everyone, and I hope that it can be shared in a way that people can resonate without needing an art history degree to understand what they're looking at or to patronise anyone. But over the years, I've had lots of opportunities to sort of reflect on my practice, and I've had brilliant, I was on the Trace mentorship programme during the making of my book. So I had Seb Chowdhury, who you've spoken to, and Hayley Morris-Cafiero, and Shan Bonnell, and Emma Bowkett, Cindy Sissoko, all helping with my practice, feeding back on the work. So there were points where I could really, really deeply delve into why I was doing what I was doing and articulating it. And I think as well, through doing talks and lectures and that sort of thing, you sort of articulate it as you go, if that makes sense. We don't always have time. Like, if I waited for everything to be perfect, I would never make anything. So,
definitely. And there is my weakness.
Yeah.
I'm a classic perfectionist, and it doesn't serve me at all. I think that's a great point. You mentioned to me that a lot of your work has to do with campaigning. And I guess I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. You know, I think that something that I don't know if we've really delved into it on the podcast in the past, but I think a really interesting thing is, you know, thinking about this tension between documentary and advocacy. And I guess campaigning definitely is part of that advocacy element. Could you speak to that a little bit?
So, yeah, campaigning, I think a lot of my work, I hope, is about human rights and land rights and, you know, ecologies and things as well. And in campaigning, I mean, a good one to talk about would be the Zero Tolerance campaign, which I was so honoured to get the role. It was 25 years since the original campaign that was set up in Scotland, in Edinburgh, by a photographer called Frankie Raffles, who's only now really getting a platform in gallery spaces, even though she passed away 30 years ago. And Evelyn Gillen, who did this campaign, they were at the time, it was like the Wonder Bra adverts were everywhere, the billboards with the Hello Boys. And they, on a almost shoestring budget, made this campaign a year after rape and marriage became illegal in Scotland. Big Zs, black and white Zs, all up the main streets on bus stops, and beautiful portraits, almost tableau narrative pictures of women. Really lovely, sort of familiar, comforting scenes of women, often in their homes or workplaces, but the text was really harrowing. So it's like a picture of a grandmother reading to a little girl, and then you look closer and it's like from 3 to 93 women are raped. And a lot of the posters had this sort of impact. And I was commissioned to do the 25-year anniversary campaign in the spirit of the original campaign. And the reason I wanted to do it is because I remember these posters from my school. I remember them being in the toilets in my primary school. I remember my teachers wearing the badges with the Zs. You know, any public building you go into now, there's a zero tolerance policy. And that comes from these two women in Edinburgh. You know, a photographer and someone who worked for the council. And I felt sort of duty bound. My daughter was 1 at the time. And in my covering letter, I wrote to them, you know, I've got a 1-year-old at home. And by the time she reaches 18, I want there to be more social change in ending gender-based violence. I want to do this for my daughter, but also because this campaign had an impact on me realising what wasn't right when I was a little girl. So I was really honoured to be given that campaign, but I felt really duty bound. Again, I had to work with lots of different partner organisations as part of the commission, which I took very seriously and spent months and months getting to know the values of all these different charities and meeting the women who worked with them, and then identifying women who I could collaborate with on narrative-based pictures, which told their stories in the way that they felt comfortable with. And part of the brief was to make it as intersectional as possible. So, yeah, and I questioned, you know, am I the right person to be doing some of these pictures, you know, because I'm working class, but I'm white. So there's a privilege there. I'm educated, I've got a degree. So I kept sort of questioning, you know, should I be saying that we should commission someone else to do this picture? But the charity were like, no, just get the work done. So maybe I was being a bit indulgent in some ways, but I just really wanted to do right by all the women that I worked with. I worked with trans women, who is now the CEO of Edinburgh Rape Crisis, who gets death threats every day. We ended up on television together on a programme called The Women Who Changed Modern Scotland, and we got interviewed together. And I made a portrait in her living room with her adopted son, and it was all about how she, with her previous role with Shakti Women's Aid, helped women with no recourse to public funds leave honour-based marriages. So we made this whole portrait in her living room together, which was all based on a significant painting, The Lady with the Lamp, that meant a lot to Myrtle. And we're still friends. Like, this is 6 years later, 7, since we made that picture. And Fatu, another woman, Fatu Balde, who I worked with at the time, was a single mother with 2 little boys under 3. And we met for a coffee, and we both shared a lot more about ourselves than you would usually. But I think that's often the case when you're collaborating with people. Everyone sort of shares together. I made a portrait of her, again, in her living room, which was immaculate. She was immaculate. And in her bare feet with comrie shells. And Fatu is an FGM campaigner, campaigning to end cutting, female genital mutilation. And she'd come to Scotland to study nursing, or she'd come to the UK to study nursing, and suddenly realised during a lecture one day that what had happened to her as a child was not ethical. I would say one of the world's top FGM campaigners. She's absolutely, I'm so in awe of her, and I'm so in awe of the day where we made a picture. She's just got really dressed up, but was in her bare feet. So there was this sort of dignity and pride and strength. And then with the boys as well, her little boys in the flat. And she had this picture on the wall that said she believed she could, so she did, which her friend had given to her. And Vida, who's my friend now as well, who was assisting me, we were just, every woman that we collaborated with were like, they're amazing. We love them so much. And Fatu's gone on. She's moved back to Ghana now. She set up her own charity. She's got an MBE. She keeps winning all these awards for making really strong social change to stop female genital mutilation. And I learned so much from her. And at the time, people didn't believe that that was also happening in Scotland. And it was. And so I was, because I was working with different people, different charities, I could feed all this back to my client as well, that this was all happening. But in the build-up to photographing these 2 women, because I met them both through Shakti Women's Aid, I went through all the training that teachers and police and, sort of looking at honour-based violence. I went to days and days of sort of training and conferences, got to know all the sort of advocates and things before I made the picture. So it might seem like too much research, some people would say, but for me, I think it's really, really important. So even though I'm saying, I don't theorise and I don't want to be too academic, I do want to be as informed as I can before I make pictures, especially when the responsibility is the representation of somebody else, and also have to make sure that they always know they can pull out at any point.
Totally. I mean, there's a lot to dig into there, but I think just on the point about educating yourself about these issues, you were talking about am I the right person to make these photographs? And I think, you can make yourself the right person, I think, by educating yourself, you know what I mean? And by putting in that work and making sure that you're positioned with and armed with the knowledge that you need, and I think that's a really great example of that. And I was curious, you were saying about making sure that people know that they have the right to withdraw. And I did want to ask you a little bit more about how you negotiate the consent process, because you also mentioned that a lot of times when you're doing these collaborative projects, you and the participants share more than you might otherwise share, and I think that sometimes that can create a difficult dynamic to set boundaries or manage expectations. So I guess I was wondering, how do you do that?
Well, always I would have, permissions forms, or some people call them model release forms, but I often make my own for projects like this. I'll use the AOP one as well and say, but this is a lot of gobbledygook language, that you might not understand. But I make my own permissions form specific to each project to make it really clear what the intention of where these pictures are going to be used and how they might be used and what context. So the Zero Tolerance project, which was called Violence Unseen, was the name of the final project. It would only be shared in the context of that project. So I would never send a picture like that to an RPS open call or something, because it has to be shown in the context of that whole campaign to end gender-based violence with quotes from the women and that sort of thing. So I make that really clear. If a picture ends up somewhere else, I will try and get it taken down, but my intention is to only use these pictures in the way that they were intended for something like that. And also with zero tolerance, I worked with women with physical and learning disabilities. And so I worked with Lisa, who was on the board at the time. Hi, Lisa, if you're listening. She helped me to make easy read model release forms, which for people with learning difficulties, they're simple and they're visual. And they say, there's a picture of me. This is Alicia. She's going to take pictures. How's it going to be used? And then sort of like their rights if they change their mind and that sort of thing. So I also make the easy read model release forms just so that there's different access points for different people so they can understand what the intention is and make 100% sure that they know this is going to go in the public domain.
And then if somebody were to withdraw, have you had that happen? Or
I can't think of it. Like, I'll probably think of something after, but I can't think off the top of my head of one just now. I know in many, John Monroe, who's one of the residents who has really, really stayed out of the spotlight. I was really honoured that he has been in two official portraits, but lots of other pictures that I've made in many. And everyone else, their pictures are accompanied with their testimonials of what happened and their experience. John's given me one quote ever in the 16 years that I've known him, and it's, "I'm a man of few words, we aren't ragged-trousered philanthropists here," which is great. I don't know if you know that book, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists. And yeah, in 2022, when I've made portraits with him again, and we were all in his kitchen and chatting about, it's awful, like, because 4 of my friends up there have died. That's one of the reasons I made a book. I wanted to make a tribute to them, their legacy, which has just ended up in the Library of Congress, which was the ambition.
Amazing.
And I said, I was like, "John, can I record a wee conversation with you?" And like, we're in the garden, chat. And I said, "What would you like to accompany your portrait in the book?" And he's just like, "Just the same as before, Alicia. I don't want to add anything else." And I was like, "Okay, so you want me to say, I'm a man of few words, we aren't ragged-trousered philanthropists here." And he's like, "Aye, that's enough."
Yeah.
It's not like he's redacting anything, but he's clear about how much he wants to be represented. And I had this other sort of dilemma whether to use it or not, but I did because it's in the film You've Been Trumped, which is a brilliant documentary. A picture that Susan Monroe talks about her sons and their mother at the beach, and it's a picture of them all paddling and the 2 boys are naked. And it accompanies Corinne Poart's song and essay that's in my book. So she wrote this spoken word piece called "I Burn But I Am Not Consumed." And so she wrote this essay, and there's a picture of the 2 boys and Susan talking about this picture with her mother and the boys paddling. And I was like, can I use that? But then I thought, well, I can because it's already in the public domain. It's in that film, so it feels like it's okay. Even though Finlay, one of the sons, he likes to live completely off grid. I think I only got his phone number 2 years ago, and I've known him for years. So it's kind of like, is that okay with them? Are they happy for me to use? So there's always that sort of, is this ethical or not? But it's a beautiful sort of connection to motherhood and the sea and the family connections we have to the water.
Yeah. I wonder if there are any other ethical dilemmas that you've encountered that you'd like to share, how you sort of dealt with it or how you navigated it, and maybe what tools have helped you to navigate ethical dilemmas or to understand how to think about ethics.
Yeah, I had a really nice experience before Christmas working with Harper's Magazine and with Catherine Humphreys, who's their photography director. And I think if a person at the top has really good ethics, it trickles down for everyone. And she gave so much care and attention to this commission that I was asked to do. And it was Kirsty Mackay, who you've interviewed before for this. It was Kirsty who recommended me to Catherine. So thank you, Kirsty. It's really nice of her. And it was working with ArtLink in a place called Bonnyrigg outside of Edinburgh with these artists who work with people with profound physical and learning disabilities. And they have these sort of informed but intuitive sort of sensory experiences that they give people. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. Really, really wonderful. And one of the artists had raised that she was concerned about being photographed because they'd had a really bad experience during lockdown where a male photographer, I don't know who it was, she didn't tell me, had parachuted in, taken pictures of them. I hate the word take pictures. and then left. And she felt like quite violated by the whole experience and the way that the work had been shown afterwards and the context of it, and no care she thought had been given to how everyone was represented. So the two artists who were working with the centre, the Lauras, so there's Laura Spring and Laura Aldridge, sorry. So Laura Spring and Laura Aldridge are these two remarkable artists, and they do these amazing, amazing experiences. And Laura Aldridge particularly was really, really concerned about who was coming, what sort of pictures were they going to make, were they going to sort of disrupt the whole flow of these sessions. So Catherine set up with myself, with Sarah Hedren, who wrote the article, and with the two artists and with representatives from the Learning Centre, we all had a Zoom conversation, and then everyone got to lay their cards on the table about their expectations. So when I went to photograph a few days later, I was completely prepared and they were prepared for me. And I knew what the boundaries were, where I could photograph, how I could photograph, and without overstepping the experience. So, you know, I sort of became part of it in the room. The people were all really excited to be part of this article. But I think it's like, because Catherine is the director of photography, for her to have that care and to listen to that worry and understand that, no, they won't get access for these pictures if they don't properly listen and reassure these artists. I thought it was really feminist of Laura to raise that as well, and it showed the sort of care that they have for the women that they were working with, that they were providing these experiences for. So I felt really lucky to be part of that, and I wish more commissions were given that amount of care, because it shone through and they were all really happy with the resulting pictures and with the article, which for me that's the gift.
The last question that I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
I did write some things down, and I've thought about this a lot because I'm still writing my ethics statement. But I think ethics for me, it's a reflection of personal values, and it's respect, integrity, compassion, and care. Ethics are different from laws, I would say. There's things that you can do legally, but it doesn't mean you should do them. So for me, that's what ethics are. It's about having good intentions and also being open to sometimes having those challenged as well, you know, because we've got ethics in the here and now, but we're always growing and changing, and our ethics should as well. For me, also, it's about treating everyone the same. You know, some photographers go to different countries or places where people are economically different from them, and they treat them differently than they would someone from their own background. I find that really problematic and unethical. So I think ethics is being empowered to be true to your own values.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Mohammed Mehdi on embedding ethics. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to take the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.